The sun was a white-hot hammer against the dust of the Nebraska Panhandle on August 14, 1886, when Thomas stood on his wraparound porch and delivered the ultimatum that would either kill his daughter's family or remake them. He was a man built of hard angles and a certainty that had been forged by 20 years of cattle ranching, and he looked at his son-in-law, Samuel, with a disappointment that was as thick as the heat. Behind Samuel, Martha held their 2-year-old son, her knuckles white against the child's cotton shirt, knowing better than to interrupt the machinery of her father's pride. Thomas did not shout, he spoke with the flat, dangerous calm of a man who had already made up his mind and was simply announcing the weather. He told them that the second homestead on the North Range was being sold to a buyer from Omaha, and that Samuel's inability to turn a profit on the dryland corn meant their time on the family ledger had reached its end. "You have until the first frost to find your own way," Thomas said, his eyes tracking the horizon where the heat shimmered like a fever dream. "I won't have my daughter starving in a house I paid for because her husband spent his time drawing diagrams in the dirt instead of callousing his palms on a plow." The deadline was more than a social rejection, it was a death sentence in a territory where timber was scarce and the cost of freighted lumber was higher than the value of the land itself. Most men in Samuel's position would have headed for the nearest railhead to beg for a laborious wage, but Samuel did not move toward the road. Instead, he looked toward the jagged, shadowed mouth of the Basalt Canyon 3 miles to the west, a place the locals called the Notch, where the land collapsed into a deep, rocky throat that everyone else considered useless for anything but hiding outlaws or losing cattle. Samuel's mind was not on the corn he hadn't grown, but on the thermal properties of the stone walls in that canyon and the way the shadows moved across its floor. He didn't ask for an extension or a loan of horses. He simply looked at the calendar in his head and began to calculate the exact number of days until the temperature would drop below 40 degrees. The ultimatum was final, and the stakes were established. By November, they would either have a structure capable of defying the high plains winter, or they would be a memory frozen into the landscape. Samuel was not a farmer by trade or by temperament, a fact that had been the primary friction point in his relationship with the local ranching elite since he arrived from the east. He had spent for years on the bridge crews of the Union Pacific, working under engineers who viewed the world as a series of load-bearing problems and heat transfer equations. To the men of the Panhandle, land was something you broke with a blade, but to Samuel, the land was a massive, untapped battery. While the other settlers built sod houses that turned into mud during the spring rains or drafty frame houses that required 10 cords of wood to survive a single blizzard, Samuel spent his few spare hours studying the basalt notch. He noticed that even in the height of the August heat, the air inside the canyon's deeper recesses remained 20 degrees cooler than the surface, and in the late evening, the black stone walls radiated a gentle, persistent warmth long after the sun had dipped. This was not magic, it was the physics of thermal mass and the high specific heat capacity of volcanic rock. The basalt absorbed the solar radiation of the day and released it at a predictable, sluggish rate. When they packed their few belongings into a single wagon, Martha didn't cry, though the skepticism of the community was a physical weight. The local storekeeper, a man named Miller, watched them load the wagon with a look of grim pity. "You're taking a pregnant woman and a toddler into a hole in the ground, Samuel," Miller said, shaking his head as he tallied the cost of 200 pounds of lime and a shipment of heavy glass panes. "There's no wood in that canyon for a fire, and the wind will howl through there like a banshee." Samuel just nodded, paying the bill with the last of his railroad savings. It wasn't the wind he was worried about, it was the orientation. He knew that the canyon's southern wall would act as a heat sink if he could position the house correctly. He wasn't building a cabin in the traditional sense, he was designing a life support system that relied on the very geology the others had dismissed as a wasteland. They arrived at the floor of the canyon on August 20th, with exactly 9 weeks to solve the problem of survival before the first killing freeze. The mechanism of their survival was rooted in a memory Samuel carried from his grandfather's masonry business in the humid hills of Pennsylvania. His grandfather had built spring houses that stayed at a constant 55 degrees year-round, regardless of whether the air outside was boiling or frozen. The secret was the depth of the earth and the thickness of the stone. Samuel knew that if he could dig into the northern slope of the canyon floor, using the earth as a literal blanket, he could bypass the extremes of the Nebraska climate. The frost line in this region was nearly 4 feet deep, but below that, the soil maintained a steady, temperate baseline. He began the excavation on the 21st, using a pickaxe and a handmade slip scraper hitched to their lone ox. The physical labor was staggering. He had to move nearly 250 cubic yards of rocky soil and basalt debris to create a level bench for the foundation. He worked from 4 in the morning until the stars were sharp in the sky, his palms cracking and bleeding despite the heavy leather of his gloves. Martha worked alongside him, clearing smaller stones and stacking them by size, while their son played in the dirt of the hole that was meant to be their floor. Every evening, Samuel would take a mercury thermometer he had salvaged from a defunct locomotive and bury it 2 feet into the fresh cut of the hillside. When he pulled it out, it consistently read 54 degrees. The physics were elegant and simple. He wasn't trying to fight the cold with a fire, he was trying to live inside the constant temperature of the planet itself. The skeptics stayed away for the first 3 weeks, but the rumors began to circulate in the town of Broken Bow. They called it the Samuel's Grave, a name that reflected the common sense of the time, that living underground was for animals and the dead. But Samuel ignored the labels. He was focused on the pitch of the floor. He dug a French drain system using crushed basalt to ensure that any moisture would seep away from the living area, utilizing a 3% grade that ensured gravity would do the work of a pump. No pump, no mechanical anything, just the inevitable pull of the earth. By mid-September, the skeletal structure of the front wall began to rise from the excavated notch. This was the most critical part of the engineering. The wall had to be thick enough to hold the weight of the roof earth, but also dense enough to serve as a thermal flywheel. Samuel built the wall 2 feet thick, using a double withe of basalt stones dry stacked with a core of packed clay and lime. He didn't use a single piece of timber for the walls themselves. Every stone was selected for its flat face and its weight, creating a massive barrier that would take days for a temperature change to penetrate. To provide light and additional heat, he installed 3 large, south-facing windows, angled at precisely 35 degrees. This wasn't a random choice, it was the calculated angle of the winter sun in this latitude. In the winter, the low-hanging sun would shine directly into the back of the room, hitting the dark stone walls. In the summer, the overhang of the canyon rim would keep the interior in the shade. It was a passive solar design decades before the term would be coined. Martha's role became more technical as the build progressed. She learned to mix the lime mortar to the exact consistency of thick cream, ensuring that every gap between the basalt stones was sealed against the coming air. The physical strain was immense. Samuel lost 15 pounds in a month, his frame becoming lean and wiry, his movements becoming more economical as he learned to handle the heavy stones with the leverage of a priber rather than raw muscle. They were surviving on salted pork and the last of the cornmeal, but the structure was rising. The community's skepticism turned into a form of social pressure, with several neighbors visiting to tell Samuel that he was inviting the damp and that his wife would surely catch the consumption in such a dark, airless cave. What they didn't see was the ventilation pipe. Samuel had buried a 4-inch clay pipe 50 feet into the hillside, running it deep underground before it entered the house. This was a geothermal intake. Even in the middle of a blizzard, the air entering the house would be pre-warmed by the Earth's constant temperature to 50 degrees before it ever hit the living room. In early October, the air turned crisp and the first frost arrived exactly as Thomas had predicted, coating the canyon rim in a delicate, temporary silver. Thomas himself rode down to the canyon on a Thursday, his horse picking its way carefully through the basalt scree. He sat in his saddle and looked down at what appeared to be a mound of earth with 3 glass eyes staring out from the hillside. There was no chimney. This was the detail that bothered Thomas the most, and it was the primary focus of his skepticism. "Samuel," he said, his voice echoing off the canyon walls, "I don't see a woodpile and I don't see a flue. You've built a cellar, not a home. You can't heat a room with hope and good intentions. Martha is 6 months along now, and you have her living in a hole with no fire. If you come back to the ranch now and admit this was a mistake, I'll let you sleep in the bunkhouse until spring." Samuel wiped the sweat from his brow, despite the 50-degree air. He didn't look offended. He looked like a man who was reading a blueprint that no one else could see. "It's not a cellar, Thomas," Samuel said, his voice matter-of-fact and devoid of the irony that usually colored his speech. "It's a bunkhouse. The earth is the insulation, and the sun is the fuel. We have the stove for cooking, but we won't need it for the cold. The stone is already holding the heat from last week. Thomas spat into the dust, his horse shifting beneath him. You're a fool, he replied. When the north wind hits this canyon, it'll be a refrigerator. I'll be back with a wagon in December to pick up what's left of you. He rode away, convinced he was witnessing the final stages of a mental breakdown. But Samuel wasn't looking at the horse, he was looking at the way the sunlight was currently hitting the back wall of the main room. The basalt was warm to the touch. Inside the house, the temperature was a steady 65 degrees, while outside, the wind was beginning to bite at the exposed skin of anyone who stayed still for too long. The open loop of the missing chimney remained a point of gossip in Broken Bow. The town expected a disaster, and they watched the calendar with the grim fascination of people waiting for a shipwreck. Samuel just finished the seal on the heavy oak door, which he had lined with wool felt to create a pressurized fit. The system was now closed, the measurements were verified, and the countdown to the Great Blizzard of 1886 had begun. November arrived with a deceptive silence, the kind of quiet that precedes a tectonic shift in the atmosphere. In the town of Broken Bow, the talk was no longer about Samuel's eccentricity but about his impending funeral. The local storekeeper, Miller, noted that there had been no sighting of Samuel or Martha for 10 days, a concerning span given the plummeting mercury. More importantly, travelers passing the mouth of the notch reported a disturbing lack of activity. There was no blue-gray wood smoke curling up from the canyon floor, a sight that in a Nebraska winter was the only reliable signal of human life. Without a chimney, the town assumed there was no fire, and without a fire, there could be no survival in the high plains. On the morning of November 18th, the pressure dropped with a violent suddenness that caused the horses in the valley to kick at their stalls in a frenzy. The Great Blizzard began not as a snowstorm, but as a wall of ice-laden wind that moved at 50 miles per hour, dropping the temperature from 30 degrees to 15 below zero in less than 3 hours. This was the Great Die-Up in the making, a storm so massive it would eventually kill hundreds of thousands of cattle across the territory. Thomas, hunkered down in his expensive frame house, watched the frost grow an inch thick on the inside of his windows despite the roaring fire in his hearth. He had 2 men constantly feeding the stove with seasoned oak, yet the tea in his cup froze if he set it more than 3 feet from the heat. His thoughts were a jagged loop of regret. He had sent his daughter into what he now believed was a basalt tomb. He paced the floor, his boots thudding on the boards, convinced that his ultimatum had been an act of unintentional homicide. The wind outside was a physical force, a white screen that erased the distinction between the earth and the sky. In the town, the structures groaned under the weight of the drifting snow, which piled 10 feet high against the doors of the general store. No one could move, no one could see, and the assumption among the locals was unanimous: the family in the canyon, without a cord of wood or a chimney to vent a stove, were already cold statues in a dark hole. The blizzard lasted for 72 hours of unrelenting whiteout conditions, burying the landscape in a suffocating shroud that redefined the geography of the Panhandle. Inside the Notch house, the reality was a jarring contrast to the chaos of the surface. While the wind chill outside plummeted to 50 below zero, Samuel stood in the center of the main room, watching the mercury in his locomotive thermometer. It hovered at 58 degrees. He didn't have a coat on, he was in his shirt sleeves, checking the moisture level on the basalt walls with a calm, practiced hand. There was no sound of the wind here, only a distant, muffled vibration that felt more like a low-frequency hum than a storm. The 3 feet of earth above them and the 2-foot-thick stone walls had effectively disconnected them from the atmosphere. The secret was the intake pipe he had buried in August. As the freezing wind whipped across the canyon floor, it was sucked into the intake vent by the pressure differential created by the home's internal warmth. As that air traveled through 50 feet of clay pipe buried deep below the frost line, it absorbed the constant 54-degree heat of the earth. By the time the air entered the cabin through the floor grate, it was no longer a killing frost, it was a temperate breeze. It was a natural furnace that required no fuel and produced no ash. Martha sat by the table, sewing a garment for the new baby, her movements calm and rhythmic. The lack of a chimney wasn't an oversight, it was a requirement for the air pressure seal Samuel had designed. They used a small kerosene lamp for light, but the primary heat source was the massive basalt wall at the back of the room. It had spent 2 months absorbing the solar energy of the Nebraska sun, and now it was releasing that stored radiation like a slow-burning battery. Not a flame, not a spark, just the inevitable physics of thermal inertia. Samuel reached out and touched the stone. It felt like a living thing, warm and steady. He had calculated the heat loss through the glass panes, his only point of vulnerability, and had covered them with heavy wool shutters he had built from old blankets and hay. The internal environment was stable, predictable, and entirely separate from the tragedy unfolding 100 feet above their heads. They had enough dried beans, salted pork, and water from the deep canyon spring to last until March. The technical success was absolute, though the world outside had no way of knowing it yet. On the fourth day, the wind died down to a low moan, and the sun broke through a sky that looked like polished steel. Thomas didn't wait for the drifts to settle. He harnessed his strongest draft horses to a heavy sled, packed it with blankets, whiskey, and shovels, and forced his way toward the canyon. He was joined by Miller and 2 other neighbors, men who felt a communal guilt for letting a family freeze. They had to dig their way into the mouth of the notch, the snow having drifted 20 feet high in some of the narrower passages where the wind had funneled the powder. When they finally reached the site of the house, they saw nothing but a white mound. There was no smoke, no movement, and the glass windows were buried under 6 feet of snow. "My God," Miller whispered, his breath a plume of white that hung in the frozen air, "they're buried alive. They've been in a tomb for 4 days." They began to dig with a frantic, desperate energy, Thomas's hands shaking as he threw shovels of heavy, packed snow aside. It took 2 hours to reach the heavy oak door. Thomas braced himself, expecting the smell of death or the sight of frozen limbs. He hammered on the wood with the butt of his shovel. "Martha!" he roared, his voice cracking with a mixture of grief and exhaustion. "Samuel! Open up if you're able." To their collective shock, the door didn't just open, it was pushed outward with a firm, steady pressure. A wave of heat hit Thomas in the face, not the dry, searing heat of a wood stove, but the heavy, humid warmth of a greenhouse in spring. Samuel stood there, looking slightly annoyed at the interruption, holding a book in one hand and a small carving tool in the other. He wasn't wearing a hat. He wasn't even wearing a vest. "Good morning, Thomas," Samuel said, his voice flat and perfectly calm. "You're a few days late for the frost, but I suppose you're here for the tour." The search party stood in the snow, their eyelashes crusted with ice, staring into a room where a woman sat comfortably in a chair and a child played on the floor in nothing but a cotton tunic. Miller stepped inside, his jaw dropping as the warmth began to melt the ice on his beard instantly. "How is it this hot?" Miller asked, his eyes darting around for a hidden fire. "There's no stove, no wood, no smoke." "How are you not dead, Samuel?" Samuel didn't offer a dramatic speech, he simply pointed to the floor grate and the back wall. "The Earth is 54 degrees, Miller. The sun is 93 million miles away, but it's still hot enough to cook a rock if you give it enough time. I just trapped the heat before it could leave." Thomas walked to the back of the room and placed his gloved hand against the basalt. Even through the leather, he could feel the radiation. He turned to look at his daughter, who looked healthier and more rested than she ever had on the ranch. "I spent $400 on cordwood this month," Thomas said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "And I still woke up with ice in my wash basin. My best bull froze to death in the barn." "You spent nothing." "Not the point," Samuel replied, crossing his arms. "The point was that you thought the land was the enemy because it wouldn't grow your corn. The land is just a system. If you stop fighting the weather and start using the geology, it works for you." The physics were elegant and simple. The vindication was not a loud triumph, it was the silent, undeniable presence of the 62-degree air. By the following week, the story of the wormhole in the notch had spread across the territory. The skepticism evaporated, replaced by a frantic, practical curiosity. Farmers who had lost their entire herds and nearly their families came to the canyon with measuring tapes and notebooks. They didn't see a grave anymore, they saw a prototype for survival. Thomas, in a rare moment of public humility, authorized the sale of the basalt rights in the canyon to a local cooperative, with Samuel as the lead consultant. The ultimatum was forgotten, or rather, it was reframed as the catalyst for a regional architectural revolution. Within 2 years, a dozen notch houses were built into the hillsides of the Panhandle, and the death rate during the subsequent winter of 1888 was nearly zero for those who adopted the thermal mass design. Samuel didn't charge for the diagrams. He simply told them that the physics were free for anyone who was willing to pick up a shovel. The community that had once dismissed him now treated him as a quiet authority, a man who had looked at a wasteland and seen a battery. The legacy of the Notch House was not recorded in the headlines of the day, but in the census records of the next century. By 1920, when the first electrical grids began to spiderweb across Nebraska, the original cabin in the Basalt Canyon was still inhabited, maintaining its steady temperature range without a single kilowatt of power or a gallon of heating oil. Samuel passed away in 1912, leaving behind a series of notebooks that detailed the thermal performance of various stone types and the optimal angles for solar gain at different latitudes. These notebooks eventually found their way into the hands of the first environmental engineers at the university in Lincoln. The building itself became a historical landmark, but more than that, it became a proof of concept for an entire school of frontier engineering that prioritized passive systems over mechanical ones. Martha lived in that house until she was 90, often telling her grandchildren about the winter of 1886 not as a time of terror, but as a time of profound silence and warmth. The Basalt Canyon, once feared as a place of desolation, became the foundation for a sustainable way of living on the high plains that predated the modern green movement by nearly a century. Today, the ruins of the original Notch House are still visible, the basalt walls as straight and true as the day Samuel laid them. There are no scorch marks on the ceiling because there was never a fire. The glass is gone, but the thermal mass remains, still absorbing the summer sun and releasing it into the empty air of the canyon, a silent monument to the idea that survival is not a matter of luck, but of understanding the elegant, simple rules of the world. The story is often told as a myth of the Old West, but for the descendants of those who survived the Great Die-Up, it is a documented history of how a vulnerable family turned a death sentence into a legacy of quiet, enduring engineering. They didn't just survive the blizzard, they redefined what it meant to live in harmony with a landscape that everyone else was trying to conquer. The physics were simple, the execution was hard, and the result was permanent.